The bank's hum of quiet efficiency shattered the moment Lisa, the teller, burst into a mocking laugh. You? With that account balance? She sneered loudly, drawing the eyes of everyone around. What she didn't know was that the man she just humiliated wasn't just any customer. He was about to change her life forever. Bottom of form, Big Shaq strolled into the high-end downtown bank, his hulking frame clad in a simple hoodie and sneakers. The sunlight streaming through the glass walls made the marble floors gleam under his feet. To most people, he might have looked like just another regular customer, but not to Lisa, the teller behind the counter. She spotted him immediately, her lips curling into a faint smirk. "Here we go again," she muttered under her breath, rolling her eyes as Shaq approached. To her, he was just another guy trying to look like he belonged in a place where wealth dressed itself in tailored suits and designer shoes. She didn't know him. She didn't recognize him. And that was the first mistake she'd make that day. Shaq waited patiently in line, his hands tucked in his hoodie pocket, a calm expression on his face. When it was his turn, he stepped up to Lisa's window and offered a polite nod. "Hi," he began, his deep voice smooth and friendly. "I'd like to check my account balance, please." Lisa didn't bother hiding her amusement. She leaned forward, her fingers tapping loudly on the keyboard. "Do you even have an account here?" she asked with a chuckle, her voice loud enough for others to hear. Shaq's smile faltered, but only slightly. "Yes, ma'am," he replied calmly. "I do." Her eyes scanned the computer screen as she pulled up his account. The number staring back at her made her pause, but not for long. "Well, isn't this a surprise?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Guess it's true what they say. Fake it till you make it, huh?" The comment hung in the air, sharp and cutting. Heads turned. A few customers whispered to each other, stealing glances at Shaq. Some looked curious, others judgmental. But Shaq didn't react. Instead, he leaned slightly closer, his tone unwavering. "Is there a problem?" Lisa shrugged, her condescension on full display. "Oh, no problem. Just wondering how someone, like you, manages to keep a balance like this." The manager, Greg, appeared at the sound of laughter from another teller nearby. He glanced at Lisa and then at Shaq, his own bias coloring his perception. "Sir," Greg said firmly, stepping in, "if you don't have legitimate business here, I'll have to ask you to leave. We don't tolerate disruptions." Shaq's gaze met Greg's, steady and unbothered. "I'm not causing a disruption," he said, "just checking my balance." But the damage was done. Whispers swirled through the lobby, customers shifting uncomfortably. After a long pause, Shaq nodded. "I'll leave," he said quietly, turning to walk out the door. The whispers grew louder as the door swung shut behind him. Nobody knew it yet, but Big Shaq wasn't walking away in defeat. He was walking away with a plan. The atmosphere in the bank shifted the moment Lisa opened Shaq's account details. Her eyes widened, a flicker of disbelief crossing her face before being replaced by a sly smirk. She leaned slightly to the side, glancing at her coworker in the next booth. "You're not going to believe this," she said, her voice just loud enough for surrounding customers to hear. "This guy claims he's got millions in his account. Doesn't look the part, does he?" The coworker raised an eyebrow, leaning over to peek at the screen. A chuckle escaped her lips as she whispered something back to Lisa. But the laughter wasn't subtle. It was cruel. Customers in the line turned their heads, curious about the commotion. The whispers started almost immediately. Some craned their necks to get a better view, while others exchanged skeptical glances. Shaq stood at the counter, calm but observant. He towered over the desk, his casual hoodie and jeans a stark contrast to the polished suits around him. A lesser person might have lashed out, but Shaq remained composed. He glanced at Lisa, whose smirk only grew wider. "Why are you wasting my time?" she said, shaking her head. "You're not serious about banking here, are you?" Her words were sharp, cutting through the room. A couple waiting on a nearby bench frowned at her tone, but no one spoke up. Another man in line whispered, "Is that Shaquille O'Neal? What's he doing here?" But Lisa didn't seem to notice, or care. Taking a deep breath, Shaq leaned in slightly. His voice was calm but carried an undeniable weight. "You know," he began, "it's not smart to judge someone by their appearance. Money doesn't always come wrapped in a suit and tie." Lisa blinked, taken aback by the remark. For a moment, the room seemed to pause. Some of the customers nodded in silent agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. But Lisa quickly recovered, rolling her eyes as she muttered under her breath, "Sure, whatever you say." At that moment, a manager appeared. Greg, the branch manager, was a middle-aged man with a stiff posture and an air of superiority. He approached the scene with a look of mild irritation, scanning the growing crowd. "What's going on here?" he asked, his tone clipped. Lisa pointed towards Shaq, a hint of mockery in her voice. "This guy claims he's got a huge balance. Can you believe that?" Greg frowned but didn't look at the screen. Instead, he turned to Shaq with a condescending smile. "Sir, if you're not here for legitimate business, I'll have to ask you to step aside. We can't have people holding up the line." Shaq raised an eyebrow, his calm demeanor unwavering. "I'm here on legitimate business, just trying to access my account." Greg crossed his arms. "Well, if that's the case, let's make it quick. We have actual customers waiting." The words hung heavy in the air, sharp and cutting. A couple of customers bristled at Greg's tone, their disapproval evident in their expressions. But no one spoke up. Lisa smirked again, her confidence bolstered by the manager's support. Shaq took a step back, his towering presence commanding attention despite his quiet composure. "I'll make it quick," he said simply. His eyes flicked to the people around him, some curious, some uncomfortable. With a nod, he turned and walked out, the glass doors closing behind him. As the murmurs filled the room again, an elderly woman near the waiting area shook her head in disapproval. "Do they even know who that is?" she muttered, but her voice was drowned out by Lisa's laughter as she turned to Greg. "What a joke," she said, shaking her head. "Who does he think he is?" But outside, Shaq wasn't defeated. He stood on the curb, hands in his pockets, watching the world pass by. There was no anger in his eyes, only quiet determination. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Shaq stepped back from the counter, his towering frame steady and calm. The snickers and judgment radiating from Lisa and Greg hung thick in the air. He glanced around the bank, his gaze sweeping across the curious customers, some whispering, others glued to their phones, filming the unfolding scene. Despite the humiliation, Shaq's demeanor remained unshaken. His expression was unreadable, though the hint of a smile tugged at the corners of his lips. "I've got time," Shaq said coolly, his deep voice carrying over the quiet murmurs. Lisa scoffed, exchanging a smirk with Greg. She leaned closer to her coworker and whispered loud enough for others to hear. "Probably spent his last dollar on those sneakers." Shaq heard her, but didn't flinch. Instead, he turned away from the counter and leaned casually against a nearby pillar. He watched silently as customers came and went, observing the way the staff interacted. Some greeted customers warmly, but others, like Lisa, were dismissive and rude, especially toward those who didn't look like serious clients. Amidst the tension, an elderly woman clutching her worn handbag approached Shaq. Her eyes widened with recognition, and she whispered, "Excuse me, aren't you Shaquille O'Neal?" Shaq gave her a small nod, leaning down slightly to meet her gaze. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice soft and kind. She glanced over at Lisa, her brows knitting together. "Do they even know who they're talking to?" the woman asked, her voice tinged with frustration. "The nerve of some people treating you like that." Shaq smiled gently, placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. "It's all right," he said. "Sometimes people don't realize who they're dealing with, but I'm used to it." The woman looked unconvinced, her gaze shifting between Shaq and the counter. "You shouldn't let them get away with this," she said firmly. "Someone needs to put them in their place." Shaq chuckled, the sound low and easy. "I've got this," he reassured her. "Thank you for looking out for me." As the woman stepped away, Lisa and Greg exchanged amused glances, clearly misunderstanding the exchange. Lisa called out mockingly, "Making new fans already?" The words stung, but Shaq's calm exterior never cracked. The manager, Greg, finally stepped forward, his expression stern but dismissive. "Look, Mr. O'Neal," he began, his tone dripping with condescension, "if you don't have legitimate business here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. We have real customers to attend to." The room fell silent. Every eye was on Shaq. The tension was palpable, and the air seemed to buzz with anticipation. Shaq straightened, his towering presence suddenly commanding the room. His voice was measured but firm as he replied, "I'm sorry if I'm holding up the line. I'll be on my way." Without another word, Shaq turned and walked toward the glass doors, his shoulders broad and unbowed. Whispers followed him as he left, some voices critical, others regretful. "What just happened?" a man near the entrance asked, shaking his head. Outside, Shaq paused for a moment, staring back at the bank. The sleek glass facade reflected the afternoon sun, but Shaq wasn't looking at the building's exterior. He was thinking about the people inside, the way they judged, assumed, and dismissed him based on nothing but appearances. For a brief moment, he considered walking away for good. But then, a slow, deliberate smile spread across his face. No, he thought. This isn't over. Not yet. The whispers inside the bank continued long after Shaq had left. Some customers voiced their discomfort with Lisa's behavior, but Greg dismissed their concerns. He wasn't serious about banking here, he insisted, brushing off the complaints. Lisa laughed, flipping her hair over her shoulder. Did you see the way he walked out? She sneered. He knew he didn't belong here. But not everyone agreed. One woman leaned over to her friend and whispered, I don't think that's the last we've seen of him. And she was right. A few days later, Shaq walked into the bank again, but this time everything about him radiated a quiet authority. Gone were the casual clothes. He wore a sharp, tailored suit, his signature chain tucked discreetly under a crisp white shirt. His expression was calm but focused, a man who knew exactly what he was about to do. Unlike his last visit, this wasn't a simple trip to the counter. He was here with a purpose. Shaq didn't approach Lisa or Greg. Instead, he walked directly to the receptionist and requested a meeting with the regional director, Mr. Chambers. The receptionist, unaware of Shaq's growing connection to the bank, hesitated. I'll have to check if he's available, she said nervously. Shaq nodded, his demeanor unwavering. I'll wait. Upstairs, Mr. Chambers had already heard about the incident. The bad press surrounding the bank's unprofessional behavior had landed on his desk, and he was scrambling to control the damage. When the receptionist informed him that Shaquille O'Neal was waiting to meet him, his heart skipped a beat. He knew this wasn't just a casual visit. Minutes later, Shaq was escorted into Mr. Chambers' spacious office. The tension in the air was palpable. Mr. Chambers, a polished man in his mid-50s, extended a hand, masking his nerves with a forced smile. Mr. O'Neal, it's an honor to meet you. What brings you here today? Shaq shook his hand firmly, his expression unreadable. Let's talk business, he said, his voice calm but commanding. Mr. Chambers gestured for him to take a seat. Of course, he said, though his mind raced. Shaq leaned forward, his gaze piercing. I've been a silent investor in this bank for years. What happened here last week? That wasn't just bad customer service. It was a failure of leadership. Mr. Chambers swallowed hard. Mr. O'Neal, I assure you, we take these matters seriously. We've already begun addressing the situation with the staff involved. Shaq raised an eyebrow. That's a start, but it's not enough. This branch has become the face of a scandal that could tarnish the bank's reputation nationwide. I'm prepared to step in and make sure this never happens again. Mr. Chambers blinked, trying to read between the lines. Step in? He asked cautiously. Shaq pulled a folder from his briefcase and slid it across the desk. I have the option to acquire a controlling stake in this branch. Consider this my formal proposal. The room fell silent. Mr. Chambers opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. His initial shock gave way to reluctant acceptance. The proposal was airtight, and Shaq's offer was more than fair. If the bank rejected it, they risked further backlash and losing a high-profile investor. After what felt like an eternity, Mr. Chambers nodded. Let me review this with the board, he said carefully. Shaq stood, adjusting his jacket. Take your time, but not too much time, he said, his tone firm but polite. I'll expect an answer within the week. The deal moved quickly. By the end of the week, Shaq finalized the acquisition, becoming the majority owner of the branch. The transaction was kept low profile. There were no press releases, no flashy announcements. Shaq wanted the changes to speak for themselves. Back at the branch, Lisa and Greg continued their daily routines, blissfully unaware of the shift in ownership. Lisa still wore her smug attitude like a badge, gossiping with co-workers and ignoring customers she deemed unimportant. Greg, ever the enabler, went along with her behavior, confident that nothing would disrupt their comfortable status quo. But things were about to change. Behind the scenes, Shaq worked closely with Mr. Chambers and a team of advisors to outline his vision for the branch. He emphasized inclusivity, professionalism, and community engagement. He wanted the bank to become more than just a place to deposit checks. He wanted to be a symbol of trust and respect for everyone who walked through its doors. As plans took shape, Shaq remained patient. biding his time until the moment was right. He knew that true change couldn't be rushed, and he was determined to approach this transformation with the same discipline and focus that had defined his career. For Lisa and Greg, the countdown had begun, though they didn't know it yet. Their complacency was about to meet Shaq's quiet but unstoppable resolve. The atmosphere in the bank was electric. Employees whispered to one another, their faces full of confusion and curiosity. Customers glanced over their shoulders, trying to understand why the day suddenly felt different. The source of the buzz was none other than Shaquille O'Neal, now dressed in a perfectly tailored navy blue suit. His mere presence radiated authority and calm power as he walked into the bank with an air of purpose. Lisa, still stationed at the counter, froze when her eyes met his. The memory of their last encounter flushed her cheeks with embarrassment, but her pride wouldn't let her show it. She forced a smile and tried to act as though nothing had happened. But her mask of confidence faltered when Greg, the manager, emerged from his office looking visibly flustered. Shaq called for a meeting with the staff, and the air grew thick with tension. Employees filed into the break room, whispering questions about the sudden assembly. As Shaq stepped to the front of the room, the staff grew quiet. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his deep voice echoing through the small space. "Some of you may remember me from my visit a few days ago." His gaze lingered on Lisa, whose face was now pale. "I'm Shaquille O'Neal, and I have some news to share." The murmurs that had started were quickly silenced as Shaq continued. "I'm the new majority owner of this branch." The silence that followed was deafening. Lisa's jaw dropped as Greg's face turned ghostly white. It was as if time stood still while the weight of Shaq's words sank in. Shaq smiled warmly, easing some of the tension. "I've been a silent investor in this bank for years, but after my recent experience here, I realized it was time for a change. My goal is to transform this branch into a place where every customer feels respected, no matter how they look or dress." Lisa's hands shook as she tried to process the revelation. Greg stammered an apology, his voice barely audible. "Mr. O'Neal, I had no idea." Shaq held up a hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said. "This is about creating a culture of respect, dignity, and inclusion for your customers and each other." Turning to Lisa, he added, "We all make mistakes. What matters is how we choose to grow from them." His words weren't harsh or accusatory. Instead, they carried the weight of someone who had faced his share of challenges and come out stronger. Lisa's voice cracked as she whispered, "I'm sorry, Mr. O'Neal." Shaq nodded graciously. "Apology accepted, but actions speak louder than words. This is an opportunity for all of us to grow and do better." The staff left the meeting with their heads buzzing, but one thing was clear. Things were about to change at this branch. Change was coming, and Shaq wasn't one to waste time. The day after his big reveal, he assembled the bank's leadership team for a meeting that would set the tone for a new era. The tension in the room was palpable as employees who had seen Shaq only as a customer now sat across from him as their leader. Shaq opened the meeting with his signature calm demeanor. "I didn't buy this bank to fire anyone," he began, addressing the unspoken fear that hung in the air. "But I also didn't buy it to keep things the way they are. We're going to rebuild this branch from the ground up, starting with respect." Everyone listened intently as he outlined his vision. The branch would become a model of inclusivity, a place where customers felt valued regardless of their appearance, background, or account balance. It wasn't just a business strategy, it was a mission to set a new standard in the banking world. One of Shaq's first directives was the implementation of mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all staff. The announcement was met with mixed reactions. Greg, the manager, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Lisa, who had been unusually quiet since the reveal, avoided eye contact altogether. Shaq noticed their discomfort but didn't call them out. Instead, he said, "Change isn't easy, but it's necessary. The way we treat people, our customers, our colleagues, and our community, defines who we are." The training sessions began the following week, led by expert facilitators who didn't shy away from addressing the hard truths. Employees participated in role-playing exercises, group discussions, and workshops designed to challenge their biases. At first, Lisa's skepticism was evident. She rolled her eyes during some activities and kept her answers curt. But as the days went on, something started to shift. During one session, the facilitator asked employees to share moments when they felt judged unfairly. Lisa hesitated before finally speaking up. I grew up in a rough neighborhood, she admitted, her voice trembling. People always assumed I wouldn't amount to anything. I guess I started judging people the way they judged me. The room fell silent as her vulnerability resonated with her coworkers. Even Shaq, who had joined the session as an observer, nodded with understanding. Acknowledging it is the first step, he said. What matters is what you do next. Meanwhile, Shaq wasn't just focused on internal changes. He wanted the bank to become a pillar of the community. Using his extensive network, he organized partnerships with local charities, minority-owned businesses, and schools. The bank hosted financial literacy workshops, small business seminars, and community events, transforming the branch into a vibrant hub of activity. Customers began to notice the difference almost immediately. The staff's newfound warmth and attentiveness were palpable. Greg, once rigid and dismissive, greeted customers with a genuine smile. Lisa, who had been the center of the initial controversy, took the most significant strides. She volunteered to help with the bank's outreach programs, spending weekends mentoring young adults on managing their finances. One Saturday, Lisa accompanied Shaq to a community event at a local school. As they spoke to students about the importance of financial responsibility, Lisa found herself moved by their enthusiasm. A young girl raised her hand and asked, "How did you learn to treat people so kindly?" Lisa paused, caught off guard by the question. "I'm still learning," she admitted, glancing at Shaq. "But I've realized it's never too late to start." The transformation didn't go unnoticed. News outlets picked up on the story, highlighting the bank's turnaround under Shaq's leadership. Headlines like "Shaq's Bank Revolution, Where Everyone Counts" began circulating, drawing attention from across the country. Customers flocked to the branch, eager to support its new mission. One day, Lisa approached Shaq in his office, her expression a mix of gratitude and humility. "Thank you," she said simply, "for giving me the chance to do better." Shaq smiled, his towering frame exuding warmth. "Everyone deserves a chance to grow," he replied. "Just keep paying it forward." As the bank continued to thrive, it became more than just a place to manage money. It became a symbol of change, a place where respect and equality weren't just ideals but daily practices. The story of Shaq's transformation of the bank rippled far beyond its walls. Social media exploded with posts praising his leadership and vision. "Shaq turns a humiliating moment into a life lesson for us all," one tweet read. News outlets picked up the story, plastering headlines like, "From judgment to justice, Shaq's bold move changes banking forever." The bank, once a place of quiet whispers and judgmental glances, became a bustling community hub. Customers who had left years ago returned, curious about the changes. Others, inspired by the story, opened new accounts, eager to support a business that now stood for inclusion and respect. One afternoon, a young man in a hoodie and sneakers walked hesitantly into the bank. He glanced around nervously, clutching a crumpled flyer advertising the bank's financial literacy program. Lisa noticed him and immediately approached, her demeanor warm and welcoming. "How can I help you today?" she asked with a smile. The man relaxed slightly. "I saw the flyer," he said. "I've never had a bank account before. I didn't think it was for people like me." Lisa's heart ached at his words. "This place is for everyone," she replied. "Let's get you started." Moments like these weren't rare anymore. The bank's new ethos had created an environment where customers felt seen and valued. Employees, once indifferent, now took pride in their work, realizing they weren't just processing transactions. They were changing lives. The story of the bank's transformation inspired other businesses to take a closer look at their practices. "If Shaq can do it, so can we," a cafe owner said in an interview, announcing his plans to implement diversity training for his staff. A local grocery store followed suit, launching an initiative to hire more employees from underrepresented communities. Shaq's actions also resonated on a deeply personal level for many. Letters poured into the bank, thanking him for leading by example. One stood out, a handwritten note from a middle school teacher in Chicago. Your story is the first time my students have seen someone turn a negative experience into such a powerful message of hope. Thank you for showing them that kindness and strength can coexist. The story didn't just inspire individuals, it challenged societal norms. On a talk show, Shaq was asked about his decision to buy the bank. The host leaned forward, clearly intrigued. Why didn't you just walk away after what happened? Shaq's answer was simple yet profound. Walking away wouldn't have fixed anything, he said. If we want to see change, we have to be part of it. This wasn't about proving a point. It was about creating a place where everyone feels respected, no matter what they look like. Back at the bank, Lisa continued her journey of redemption. She worked tirelessly to rebuild trust, not just with customers, but with herself. One day she approached Shaq after a team meeting, her expression earnest. I know I've got a lot to make up for, she said, but I want you to know I'm all in. I want to help you make this place everything it can be. Shaq's response was as calm and measured as ever. It's not about the mistakes you've made. It's about what you do next. Keep showing up. The impact of Shaq's ownership wasn't limited to the bank or even the city. It sparked a national conversation about respect, inclusivity, and the importance of not judging a book by its cover. As the story continued to circulate, people from all walks of life found themselves reevaluating their own biases. Through it all, Shaq remained grounded. For him, this wasn't about headlines or accolades. It was about using his platform to make a difference. And as he walked through the bank one morning, greeting employees and customers alike, it was clear that his mission was succeeding. The bank, once seen as a cold, impersonal institution, was now the beating heart of the community. Under Shaq's leadership, it became a place where people felt valued and respected, a symbol of what could happen when compassion met action. Inside the newly revamped branch, the atmosphere was transformed. Bright murals of diverse faces adorned the walls, painted by local artists commissioned by Shaq. A bold slogan stretched across the entrance, where every customer counts. The branch bustled with energy. Teenagers attended financial literacy workshops, single parents got personalized advice on loans, and elderly customers were greeted like family. Shaq walked through the lobby, his towering presence commanding respect but radiating warmth. He paused to chat with a customer, a young woman balancing a baby on her hip while signing up for a savings account. You're doing great, Shaq said, flashing an encouraging smile. This is the first step toward something big. Lisa stood nearby, guiding a new hire through the onboarding process. She had come a long way since the day of her public humiliation. At first, the mandatory diversity training had felt like a punishment, but over time, it opened her eyes. She saw herself in the stories shared by colleagues and customers who had faced prejudice. Slowly but surely, she began to change. Now, Lisa was one of the bank's biggest advocates. She had started volunteering at local shelters, helping underserved communities navigate the banking system. I used to judge people for how they looked, she admitted in an interview months later. But Shaq showed me that every person has a story, and sometimes all they need is someone to believe in them. The transformation didn't go unnoticed. The bank was now the subject of glowing headlines and viral posts. Shaq turns bank into beacon of hope, one article declared. Social media buzzed with admiration, with fans calling him a modern-day hero. One particularly moving moment came during a televised interview where Shaq reflected on the journey. I didn't set out to own a bank, he said, leaning forward earnestly. I just wanted to remind people that respect doesn't cost a dime. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, no matter what. The interviewer smiled. And now you've created a legacy. But for Shaq, it wasn't about legacy. It was about impact. He used the bank as a springboard to launch more initiatives, funding scholarships for underprivileged students, and partnering with local businesses to create job opportunities. He even hosted town halls at the branch, giving community members a chance to voice their concerns and ideas. The ripple effects were undeniable. Other businesses in the area began adopting similar policies, inspired by Shaq's approach. It's not just about making money, a restaurant owner said during a local news segment. It's about making a difference. As for Greg, the former manager, he had a quieter redemption arc. After stepping down, he worked behind the scenes to support the bank's community outreach programs. Though he avoided the spotlight, he expressed gratitude to Shaq during a private meeting. You gave me a second chance, he said. I don't want to waste it. Months later, the bank celebrated its first anniversary under Shaq's ownership with a community festival. Food trucks lined the parking lot, local musicians performed, and kids ran through the crowd clutching balloons emblazoned with the bank's new logo. Shaq stood at the center of it all, a smile of quiet pride on his face. As the sun dipped below the horizon, he looked up at the bank's sign glowing brightly against the evening sky, where every customer counts. It wasn't just a tagline, it was a promise. And as Shaq greeted customers one by one, shaking hands and exchanging kind words, it was clear that he had turned a moment of judgment into a movement of change, a legacy that would last for generations.